15 years ago, his sister vanished without a trace. During a summer barbecue, no screams, no struggle, just silence. Now, returning to their childhood home, he hears her voice whispering from behind the wall. As he searches for answers, he uncovers hidden rooms, erased memories, and a darkness that has been feeding on his family's grief. What if she was never truly gone? What if the house remembered everything, and wants him to remember too? The house was quieter than he remembered. Not the kind of quiet that soothed, but the kind that pressed against your ears, made the blood in your head pulse a little louder, a little slower. He stood in the doorway of what used to be the living room, now stripped bare, no couches, no framed photos, just the pale outline of where the family rug once was. Dust motes drifted like ash in the muted late afternoon light. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his boots seemed intrusive, as though he were trespassing in a place long abandoned by time and memory. It had been over a decade since he'd last set foot in this place. 15 years since the summer of 1993. Before we go further into the secrets hidden beneath this house, into the whispers, the photos, and the truth that was never meant to surface, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories are fragile, buried deep in silence, and your support helps bring them back into the light. A small action for you means everything to the work we do. Thank you. 15 years since everything changed. The house had been left to him after both parents passed, his father suddenly, his mother slowly, swallowed by silence and sleep. He hadn't planned on staying long, just to pack the remaining boxes, clean out what was left of the ghosts, and leave. But something had been pulling at him ever since he arrived. A vague unease, like forgetting why you walked into a room but knowing it mattered. He moved through the hallway, each step echoing a memory he didn't want to remember. There had been laughter here once, hers especially. The kind of laughter that spun in circles, that filled the space between meals, between fights, between everything. She was younger by 2 years, always dancing just out of reach, always leaving behind a trail of questions. And then one day, she was gone. He paused at the base of the stairs, hand brushing the wood of the banister worn smooth by time and touch. That was when he heard it. It was faint. So faint, he almost mistook it for the wind moving through the cracks in the window panes. But it wasn't wind. It was a whisper. Delicate. Tattered. And it said his name. He froze, heart stalling, ears straining. Nothing. Only silence again, deeper now, more deliberate. A trick of memory, maybe. Or a hallucination drawn from the house's rot and the loneliness that clung like mildew. He turned, slowly, letting his eyes scan the empty room behind him. His gaze caught on the far wall, one that divided the house from the crawlspace beneath the stairs. Then it came again. This time, closer. A breath, barely more than air, but unmistakably shaped like a voice. Daniel. His name. He stumbled back, hitting the wall opposite. The sound had come from inside the plaster. Not behind it. Inside it. A voice woven into the framework of the house. A voice he hadn't heard since she was 8 years old. It was impossible. She was gone. Dead, they assumed, though no body was ever found. The case grew cold, long before the soil over her absence did. But this voice, this sound, it wasn't a memory. It wasn't a dream. It was happening now. In real time. In his ear. In his bones. He placed a trembling hand against the wall. The surface was cool, still, but his gut twisted with recognition. That voice had once called to him during thunderstorms, had sung off-key lullabies from the room across the hall, had screamed the day she disappeared. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. And yet, Daniel. Louder, more insistent, and beneath it, something else. A rustling, like fingernails on wood, like something shifting just beyond reach. He pressed his ear to the wall, breath held tight in his throat. And then, again so close now, it felt like it was inside his head. "I never left." He tore himself away, stumbling back into the empty hall. His hands were shaking, eyes wide. The air in the house felt heavier now, like the walls were watching. Listening. Waiting. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. The sun had hung low and lazy over the backyard, a syrupy July heat thick in the air, making every breath feel like it passed through molasses. The scent of charred burgers clung to the breeze, mingling with citronella and the occasional hint of freshly cut grass. Laughter echoed off the fence panels and fluttered into the treetops like startled birds. It was the kind of day that seemed suspended in amber, too golden, too perfect, too still. And maybe that was the warning they'd all missed. The calm before the fracture. Daniel had been 10 years old. That strange age where you're old enough to know boredom, but not yet old enough to understand loss. He remembered holding a paper plate, its corners soggy with ketchup, and watching ants crawl up the leg of the folding table. His uncle had been telling some story loud, dramatic, hands slicing the air, and everyone was pretending to laugh harder than they actually felt. That's how adults did it. Performative joy. A game of pretending the weight of the world didn't sit just behind their teeth. She had been dancing. His sister, Emily, spinning barefoot on the lawn, her arms outstretched like wings, her dress catching the light every time she turned. She'd tied one of their mom's scarves around her head, pretending to be a pirate, or a princess, or both. She didn't believe you had to choose. She kept calling to him, beckoning him to come play, but he'd shrugged her off, more interested in a Game Boy than her silly games. She always lived in that space just outside the frame of everyone else's attention. Never loud enough to be scolded, never quiet enough to be ignored. Then she was gone. No scream, no commotion, just an absence. He didn't notice it first. No one did. Not until their mom asked where Emily was, and no one could answer. It was a casual question, tossed like a stone across a pond. But it never made the second skip. Just sank, fast. They called her name once, then again, then 10 more times. The energy shifted. The laughter dried in midair. Their father's voice turned sharp, cracking at the edges as he barked instructions. Spread out. Check the woods. Check the street. Knock on neighbors' doors. But it was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed her whole. Daniel remembered running. Through bushes. Around the side of the house. Into the shaded stretch where the backyard bled into thicket and then into forest. He kept thinking she would pop out from behind a tree, giggling, her hands sticky with stolen popsicle syrup. But the deeper he went, the louder the silence grew. The police came. Dogs, flashlights, clipboards. They asked questions he didn't understand. Had she been upset? Did anyone strange come by? Was there any reason she'd want to run away? And every answer felt like a lie because it couldn't explain the most basic truth. She was just gone. The barbecue plates were still on the table when the sun went down, plastic cups half full. A frisbee lay in the grass, abandoned mid-game. The day rotted fast. That's what he remembers most. How quickly the warmth curdled. The air turned cold, even though the heat lingered. And from that day on, everything in the house changed. Doors stayed shut. Voices lowered. Photographs came down from the walls, one by one. And in their place, a silence grew. Not the kind that healed, the kind that haunted. He would replay that day over and over, for years to come, always wondering what moment he missed. What second she slipped through the cracks. What sound might have warned him had he been listening. The town had never seen anything like it. One missing child, and suddenly every inch of normalcy peeled away like dead bark. Streets that once echoed with bike bells and idle chatter turned grim and silent. Sidewalks became bulletin boards, each utility pole wrapped in sun-warped flyers bearing the same wide-eyed photo. Emily Morris, age 8, last seen wearing a blue sundress and red sneakers, missing since the 17th of July. Her smile was frozen in time, oblivious to the horror that would consume everything in its wake. At first, it was chaos, but the kind that felt purposeful, organized panic, if such a thing could exist. The police set up barricades at both ends of Main Street. Volunteers flooded in from nearby counties, armed with maps, walkie-talkies, and a determined kind of hope. Local stores donated bottled water and granola bars. Churches opened their basements. The high school gym became a command post, its basketball hoops shadowed by cots and evidence boards. Strangers hugged each other in the grocery store aisles. Everyone became family for a while. Helicopters buzzed overhead like angry wasps, their spotlights sweeping the woods, the creeks, the schoolyard. Dogs barked through the night, trained noses straining to catch a trail already half erased by time and wind. Every square inch of the forest behind the Morris house was combed first in neat grids, then in circles, then in aimless, desperate lines. No stone was left unturned, but none held answers. Only moss, earth, and silence. The days blurred together. One week bled into the next, then the one after that. August arrived hot and angry. September brought early rains. By October, the leaves had started to fall, blanketing the town in rust-colored denial. And still no Emily, no leads, no ransom call, nothing. Theories spread like mold. Maybe she wandered off and fell into a ravine. Maybe someone took her and drove far away. Maybe, some whispered, she never left the house at all. But the police found nothing. No signs of struggle, no footprints, no broken window, just absence. Daniel watched it all unravel from the eye of the storm. His world shrank to the corners of the living room, where the news flickered across the television in muted colors. He saw his parents' faces harden, grief calcified behind their eyes. His mother folded laundry she hadn't washed, as though routine might bend time and bring her daughter back. His father stopped speaking altogether, pouring himself into late nights at the kitchen table with maps, notes, and cold coffee, as if the answer was buried in the margins. The search changed the town, permanently. Children were kept indoors. Locks were double-checked. Halloween was canceled that year. Emily's name became a whisper, then a myth, then something people tried not to mention at all. Her classmates moved on grade by grade, while her empty desk gathered dust and avoidance. Life continued, because it had to, but it limped. By winter, the flyers were tattered and fading. The volunteers stopped coming. The helicopters were long gone. The case became cold in official terms, but for the Morris family, it was never anything but burning. People stopped calling to check in. Sympathy turned awkward. Eyes darted away when they passed through the grocery store. Everyone wanted to forget what had happened, but forgetting felt like betrayal. Daniel never stopped listening, even when it seemed pointless. Even when his parents finally moved on, not in heart, but in habit. Something in him refused to accept the finality of silence. He'd look out at the woods and feel a pull, not from memory, but from something deeper, something raw. He didn't know it then, but part of her had never left. The town had buried the search, but the house hadn't. The house remembered. The house had always been strange in the way that old houses are full of corners that held onto cold air too long, pipes that knocked in the night like restless bones, doors that sometimes resisted opening, as though protesting the intrusion. But Daniel had learned to ignore those things. As a child, he had assumed every house creaked and breathed and murmured in the dark. As an adult, he chalked it up to aging infrastructure and the stretch marks of time. That is, until the voice returned. It had been 2 nights since he first heard it, whispering his name from inside the wall. 2 nights of pacing floors and staring at the peeling wallpaper in the hallway outside his childhood bedroom. He told himself it could be anything: wind, plumbing, even an old recording trapped somehow in the walls. But deep down, he knew better. The voice was too soft, too deliberate. It didn't echo. It pulsed. It led him, inevitably, to the basement. He hadn't been down there in years. The air hit him the moment he opened the door, cool and sour, like mildew and dust had made a quiet agreement never to leave. The wooden stairs groaned under his weight, the old chain-pull bulb swaying slightly as he reached the bottom. Shadows spilled from the corners like ink. The basement hadn't changed much. Shelves lined with rusted tools, boxes of forgotten holidays, a broken rocking horse tucked behind the furnace. But then he saw it. The far wall concrete, mostly bare, held something that didn't belong. A section of the foundation, crudely boarded over with mismatched planks. Some were splintered, others stained, all of them nailed in with a kind of desperate energy. Not clean carpentry, not repair, more like a seal. As if someone had been trying to keep something in, not out. Daniel approached slowly, flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. His breath caught in his throat, a tension rising in his chest like nausea. He couldn't remember this part of the wall. Had it always been there? Had he just never noticed? The dimensions of the basement suddenly felt off, the space unfamiliar in a way that made his skin crawl. He reached out and touched the boards. Cold. Rough. Real. That's when he heard the sound again. Not a whisper this time, but a sigh. Long, faint. Like breath escaping through stone. It came from behind the boards. He staggered back, heart punching hard against his ribs. The flashlight slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor and spinning. The beam slicing through the dark in frantic arcs. He crouched to retrieve it, hands shaking, knees weak. He should have left it alone. He should have walked away, pretended he never heard anything. But something in that sound, it wasn't threatening. It was mournful, familiar, like someone forgotten, waiting to be remembered. He examined the boards again, noticing now the rusted hinges at the edge of the frame. This hadn't always been sealed. It had once been a door, a doorway. To what? He didn't know. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. But not the peaceful kind. The charged, expectant kind. Like a held breath. He stepped back, staring at it, the flashlight heavy in his grip. He thought of his father's silence, the way his mother avoided questions, the strange gaps in their stories. There had always been something beneath their grief, something they never spoke about. Maybe it started here. Maybe it ended here too. He didn't open it. Not yet. But he knew he would. The house wasn't just holding memories. It was hiding them. And this room they had never spoken of was waiting. It took effort to pry the boards loose. The nails, rusted and stubborn, resisted him, like the house itself was unwilling to give up its secrets. But the wood eventually splintered, groaned, and gave way under the pressure of a crowbar and years of neglect. Behind them, the opening was narrow, a jagged rectangle leading into a crawlspace that smelled of time left unkept, earth, rot, and something fainter, more chemical. A cold breath of air seeped out, brushing past Daniel's face like fingers brushing his skin. He hesitated for a long moment before stepping inside. The flashlight's beam cut through the dust, revealing cobwebs stretched like old gauze across wooden beams. The floor was uneven dirt mixed with concrete patches, like someone had started work here and abandoned it halfway. The space felt cramped, not just physically but emotionally, as though it had absorbed every unsaid word that had ever passed through the house. This place had been kept secret for a reason. Near the back corner, half buried beneath a warped floorboard, he found a cardboard shoebox, crumbling at the corners, coated in a soft film of dust. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just another relic in a house filled with forgotten things. But something about the way it was tucked into the crawlspace, deliberately placed, not discarded, made his pulse quicken. He sat down on the cold ground and opened it. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them. Stacked without care, edges curled, the gloss dulled by time. The first few showed familiar faces. His sister, Emily, in her blue sundress, sitting cross-legged on a floor he didn't recognize. Her expression was blank, not frightened, not joyful, just distant, as though looking at something past the camera or through it. She wasn't alone in all of them. In some, she sat beside other children, boys and girls he didn't know. All around her age, none smiling, none speaking. He flipped through the stack faster now, his breath hitching with each new face. Different children, different postures, but always the same setting. The same pale wallpaper in the background, repeating a faded floral pattern that seemed to close in tighter the longer he looked at it. The lighting never changed. The composition never shifted. No windows, no clocks, just still, silent children, and that wallpaper, like the world outside had been scrubbed away. There were too many of them. Dozens of kids, always alone or in pairs, always indoors. He searched the photos for clues, a calendar, a mark, anything that might offer a context. But there was nothing, just the stillness. The sameness. A strange kind of choreography frozen in chemical color. And then, one of the last photos, Emily again. But this time, she was facing the camera directly. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, as if she had just started to speak or had just stopped. The wallpaper behind her looked wrinkled, warped, as though the wall itself was folding inward. And in the corner, just barely visible behind her shoulder, the shadow of a man, out of focus, standing still. Daniel dropped the photo like it had burned him. His hands shook as he reached for the others, but the images were all blurred now, his vision trembling with panic. He stuffed them back into the box, slamming the lid shut. His thoughts spiraled. Who were those children? Why were they photographed like this? Where had the room in the photos been? He glanced around the crawl space. The walls here were exposed, brick, raw and cold. No wallpaper, no familiar patterns. And yet, the wallpaper in the photographs tugged at something in his memory, something buried too deep to name. This wasn't just evidence. It was a record. And it had been hidden on purpose. The town looked the same, at least from a distance. The same brick storefronts lining Main Street, their paint gently faded by years of soft summers and bitter winters. The same diner, still serving pie and burnt coffee under the buzz of flickering fluorescent lights. The same library, its tall windows glinting in the sun like watching eyes. But when Daniel walked its sidewalks now, there was something hollow in the air, like a breath held too long. The place felt familiar, but no longer real. As if it were a memory someone else had tried to repaint. He started with the neighbors. The Sims family, who used to host summer cookouts and lend lawnmowers, no longer lived next door. Their house had been sold 5 years ago to a couple from the city who'd never heard of Emily Morris, let alone the day she vanished. The Davenports, 2 doors down, still lived in the same tan bungalow with the cracked porch steps. Mr. Davenport answered the door with a cautious smile, but his eyes darkened the moment Daniel mentioned her name. "Long time ago," he said, scratching at his temple. "Tragic, sure, but folks move on, you know?" "I'm not sure everyone did," Daniel replied, watching the man's discomfort tighten around his mouth. Mr. Davenport shrugged. "Well, we didn't see much, can't really remember the details. You know how at Island." But Daniel did remember. The Davenports had joined the first search party. He remembered seeing Mrs. Davenport in the woods, holding a flashlight with shaking hands, crying softly. And yet now, they spoke as if it had all been a bad dream, one they had willed out of existence. The rest of the street wasn't much different. Neighbors changed the subject. Others pretended they didn't know who he meant. Some even seemed offended that he'd bring it up at all, As if Emily's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy but a taboo. He drove to the police station next, a squat concrete building that always seemed too small for anything serious. The woman at the front desk was polite, young, probably in her early 20s. When he asked to see records from 1993, she hesitated. "Anything specific?" she asked, fingers poised above her keyboard. "My sister," he said. "Emily Morris. Missing persons report filed July 17th. She typed, waited. Her brows furrowed. "Huh," she muttered. "That file's not digitized. Must be in the archives." He waited while she disappeared behind a locked door. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When she returned, her expression was uneasy. "I'm sorry. We don't seem to have that file anymore. Could be misfiled, or purged during the system changeover a few years back." "Purged?" His voice cracked. "It happens sometimes with older cases, especially if they were inactive for a long time. But it was never solved." "I understand," she said, avoiding his eyes. "But there's nothing here." He left without speaking, the door closing behind him like a verdict. On the way out, he paused at the bulletin board in the lobby. A collage of current notices, lost pets, fundraisers, missing persons. No sign of Emily. No trace she had ever existed. That night, he searched online, local news archives, message boards, cold case databases. Her name came up once in a decades-old newspaper scan, but the article was short, vague. The photo blurry. There was no follow-up, no trail. She had been written out of the town's history with surgical precision. The next morning, he visited the local library, one of the last places still holding on to dusty microfilm and yellowed clippings. The librarian, an older woman with a sharp face, glanced at the index card he handed her. Emily's name. "I remember the day she went missing," the woman said quietly. "I was here, everyone was, but I wouldn't expect to find much in the archives." "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because someone made sure we wouldn't." Daniel stood there, her words hanging in the air like a sentence unfinished. Whatever had happened to his sister wasn't just forgotten. It had been erased. The box of VHS tapes sat in the far corner of the attic, half collapsed and speckled with mouse droppings. Daniel had found it beneath an old quilt, buried under years of insulation, dust, and neglect. The tapes were unlabeled except for faint pencil scrawls: holidays, birthdays, BBQ, 92, the kind of lazy shorthand his father used when cataloging home videos. He hadn't seen these in years. Part of him didn't want to. But something, the same impulse that drove him back to this house, that pushed him into asking questions no one wanted to answer, told him he had to. He set up the old VCR on the floor of the living room, the screen flickering to life with that familiar static blue. The first tape clicked into place with a mechanical sigh. He pressed play. At first, it was harmless nostalgia. Grainy footage of his younger self wobbling on a bicycle, his father behind the camera narrating with dry humor. Christmas mornings, wrapping paper explosions, their mother in a long robe and tired smile. Birthday candles, sparklers, the past unspooling in pixelated fragments. Then he noticed it. Emily wasn't there. It was subtle at first, an absence you only recognize once you're looking for it. The Christmas of '91, for example. He remembered distinctly that she got a dollhouse that year, a huge pink monstrosity they had to assemble for hours. But on the tape, she's nowhere in sight. No squeals, no unwrapping. Just Daniel, alone, opening gifts. A quiet Christmas. No explanation. He fast-forwarded to another tape marked Emily 7th. The birthday party. He remembered the cake, unicorn-shaped, purple frosting. He remembered their backyard, filled with kids from school, water balloons, the laughter. But on the tape, the event was off. The camera lingered too long on empty corners. Faces blurred by motion. There were children, but fewer than he recalled. No games, no balloons. And Emily wasn't there, not in a single frame. It was her birthday, and yet the only child clearly visible was Daniel. He ejected the tape, breath tight in his throat. One by one, he fed the others into the machine. Each time, the pattern repeated. Her name scrawled on the label, but her presence erased. The camera panned away just as she should have entered. Moments ended mid-laugh, cut abruptly to black. Her voice never captured, her face never seen. Some tapes had visible jumps, jarring edits where the footage fractured, stuttered, and resumed with something missing. A scene of the two of them coloring at the kitchen table cut to static, then resumed with only Daniel. He remembered her being there. He remembered her drawing spirals in red crayon. But on the screen, it was like she'd never existed. Someone had gone through the effort of removing her. Not erasing the tapes entirely, that would have drawn suspicion, but trimming, carefully, selectively, making her absence feel natural, plausible, like she had simply grown distant or withdrawn. Like the memory of her had always been as faint as it felt now. Daniel rewound the last tape and sat in the flickering dark of the living room, the hum of the VCR matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. It wasn't just the town. It wasn't just the police. It was the house. The family. The memories themselves. His sister wasn't lost. She had been erased, slowly, methodically, almost lovingly, like someone didn't want her to be found. The desk still smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, familiar, almost comforting, until Daniel remembered how much he'd avoided it growing up. It had belonged to his father, a man of few words but heavy silences, who spent long nights hunched over this desk, scribbling in a way that had never made sense to a child. After Emily disappeared, those nights had grown longer. The door to the study had remained shut more often. The desk became a place no one touched, like a shrine or a vault. Daniel had avoided it all week, circling the study like something toxic pulsed beneath its floorboards. But now, as the weight of missing memories pressed harder on his shoulders, he stood before it, flashlight trembling in one hand, the other slowly sliding open drawers stiff from disuse. Paperclips, dead pens, receipts, yellowed tax documents. It was like peeling back the layers of a man who had lived his life folded inward. The bottom right drawer didn't budge. Daniel paused. He tugged again, harder this time. Nothing. Then he noticed the faint scrape of metal underneath. A lock. One he hadn't realized was there. It wasn't difficult to force. A flathead screwdriver and a surge of adrenaline did the trick. The drawer creaked open with a groan that echoed too loudly in the stillness of the house. Inside was a single item. A leather-bound journal. The cover cracked, the corners worn soft by time and repeated touch. No name on the front, no title. Just a threadbare strap holding it closed, as if whatever lived inside had to be kept from escaping. He undid the strap with hesitant fingers and opened it. The first pages were dated the year after Emily vanished. 1994. His father's handwriting, looping and familiar, danced erratically across the page. At first, it seemed like grief. Stream of consciousness ramblings, fragmented sentences filled with pain, guilt, and confusion. But the further Daniel read, the less it felt like mourning and the more it felt like obsession. She's still here. I hear her. That line was underlined twice, followed by a series of erratic entries that made Daniel's skin crawl. The voice behind the wall comes at night, too soft to trace. It isn't her, not exactly. Some nights, the house hums. Low, like it's breathing. I shouldn't have opened it. I thought I sealed it. God forgive me. There were sketches in the margins. Symbols he didn't recognize, circles within circles, interlocking triangles. Jagged lines that reminded him of sigils carved into old gravestones. More entries followed, growing increasingly unhinged. I rebuilt the barrier, twice now. It keeps shifting. She speaks in riddles, doesn't remember who she was, or pretends not to. There are gaps in her, like holes in the sky. Then, further in, a passage that made Daniel's blood run cold. I can't tell your mother. She wouldn't survive it. Better to let her believe Emily is gone. Better to erase the photos. The tapes. If no one remembers, maybe it will stay asleep. Daniel stared at the words, bile rising in his throat. His father had known something was still in the house, that it wasn't just grief gnawing at the edges of their lives, but something real, something ancient, hungry, and hiding. And instead of facing it, he had buried it behind walls and silence, behind sealed doors and doctored memories. All in the name of protection. But protection for whom? Daniel flipped through the final pages. The writing was shakier, barely legible. It wants to be remembered. That's how it opens. Through memory, through grief. I can't hold it much longer. That was the last entry. No date, no farewell. Just an ink blot, smeared and dark, as if the pen had lingered too long in a single place. Daniel closed the journal slowly, the weight of it heavier now. His father hadn't just been broken by loss. He had been consumed by something deeper. Something that had made a home in the empty spaces where Emily used to be. And maybe, just maybe, it was still here. The nights had grown colder, though the thermostat remained unchanged. Daniel found himself layering sweatshirts and blankets, yet the chill never lifted, not from the air, but from the feeling that something unseen stirred just beyond the reach of warmth. The house no longer slept when he did. It seemed to come alive with dusk, breathing through the walls, shifting in its bones. And at the center of it all was the attic. It started with the whisper again, his name, just once, faint and frayed, curling down the stairwell like smoke. Then came the humming. At first, he thought it might have been the wind squeezing through the eaves, or maybe a television left on somewhere. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like something trying to remember a song it hadn't sung in years. A tune hovered on the edge of recognition, soft, uneven, dragging one note into the next, as though time itself had warped the melody. It was a lullaby. Not just any lullaby, but one he hadn't heard since childhood. Emily used to sing it, in her small, pitchy voice, whenever she played with her dolls. He could hear her, even now, in memory, ring around the rosy. But what came from above was wrong. Slower, lower. Like a recording played back at half speed, the syllables distorted and off-key, each note stretched until it bled into the next. The innocence of the rhyme twisted into something mournful, almost mocking. Daniel stood at the foot of the attic stairs, flashlight in hand, staring up at the pull string that dangled from the hatch. He hadn't opened it since arriving, hadn't needed to. But now the sounds left him no choice. Each night they came earlier, lingered longer, like something waiting for an invitation. He pulled the string. The ladder groaned as it unfolded. The scent hit him instantly: dust, mothballs, and something else. Damp wood and something sweet but spoiled, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The humming paused, just for a moment, as if it knew he was listening, and then resumed. He climbed slowly. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over forgotten boxes, old trunks, a broken fan. Nothing moved, but everything felt aware. The insulation was exposed in places, pink and crumbling, like the skin of the house had worn thin. In the far corner, beneath a sloped beam, sat a rocking chair. It rocked once, then stilled. The sound was louder now, not in volume, but in presence. It seemed to vibrate from the walls themselves, echoing in the beams, rising from the floor. The lullaby continued, now slipping from one song into another, as though it couldn't remember which belonged here. Hush, Little Baby became London Bridge. Became something Daniel didn't recognize at all. A melody that had no words. A song no child should know. He called out, "Emily?" The humming stopped. Silence fell with such force it made his ears ring. Then footsteps. Light, bare, padding slowly across the floorboards above the ceiling. Except there was no above here. He was already at the top. Daniel stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The chair creaked again, though no one sat in it. Then, from the far end of the attic, came a whisper, not his name this time, but something else. Something wet with breath, stitched with a rasp. It wasn't a word he knew. But it wasn't gibberish either. It was language stripped of meaning. A voice still trying to learn how to speak. He backed away, down the ladder, never turning his back. The attic hatch closed above him with a soft thud, as if by its own decision. Back in the hallway, Daniel pressed his back to the wall and listened. No more humming, no more steps. But from the darkness above came the faint, deliberate rhythm of breathing. It was waiting. And it remembered every note. Daniel had begun tearing down the wall not out of courage, but necessity. The sounds wouldn't stop. They grew louder with each passing night. Whispers crawling across the ceilings. The slow humming of songs no one should remember. He couldn't sleep, could barely think. It felt like the house was tightening around him, like it was trying to hold something in or keep something out. Either way, he had to see what was behind the plaster. He had to know if what his father wrote in that journal was true. The basement wall was stubborn, layered. Beneath the plaster was old wood, and beneath the wood, stone. Each layer resisted, as though put there not just for structure, but as a seal. As if the room on the other side had not merely been hidden, but buried. Daniel chipped and hammered, the dust choking his breath. Sweat mixing with panic in his eyes. Every strike of the crowbar felt like it echoed deeper than it should, as though it were reverberating through time. Then, finally space. A hollow knock. The last panel gave way with a sigh, revealing a dark rectangular cavity no more than 10 feet across. He stepped back, the opening yawning like a mouth. He aimed his flashlight inside. It was a room. A small, windowless space tucked between the foundation walls. The air that spilled out was stale and metallic, older than dust. The room was empty of furniture, but not of presence. The concrete floor was worn, smeared with faint discolorations and old dust trails. The walls were bare except for the far side, where something had been scrawled in the faintest crayon sunbursts, crooked stick figures, and 2 initials. E.M., drawn in blocky child's letters. Below it, in smaller, messier script, a date, 1994. Daniel stepped inside. The sound of his own breathing filled the space, amplified, as if the room didn't know what to do with noise anymore. It had the texture of a place long starved of sound. The air was thick, unmoving, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. His light scanned the floor. Scratches lined the concrete, near one corner shallow gouges. A child's desperate attempts to claw something open, or escape. He knelt by the wall with the drawing, fingertips tracing the faded wax. The son had a sad face. One of the stick figures had X's for eyes. The other held something red too dark to be crayon, too smeared to be clear. The shape reminded him of a key, or a knife. There was no door, no closet, no furniture. Just this shell of a room, hidden between the walls like a secret the house was ashamed to keep but too afraid to release. He sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Trying to understand what kind of person could leave a child in a room like this without light, without windows, without sound. But maybe it wasn't a person. Maybe it was the house, or something older. Something that had made its nest within the walls and whispered lies into the ears of grieving parents. The longer he stayed, the more the air pressed against him, like the room wanted him to leave or wanted him to stay. As he turned to go, the beam of his flashlight caught a faint impression in the dust near the wall, a small outline, like the imprint of a hand. It hadn't been there when he walked in. It was fresh. Daniel hadn't planned to go back to the photos. After finding the hidden room, after standing in that sealed space breathing in the rot of time and memory, the last thing he wanted was more proof. But the box called to him. It sat on the table like a wound that refused to close, its frayed corners curling upward, as though the air itself was trying to get in and breathe life into what it held. He opened it again late one evening, the house around him dim and unmoving, and began flipping through the Polaroids one by one, slower this time. Studying. Not for answers, he didn't expect those anymore, but for patterns. It was halfway through the stack that he saw it. The photo was familiar. Emily seated cross-legged on a linoleum floor. The same faded floral wallpaper behind her. That same hollow look in her eyes. Too still, too blank. But in the corner, partially obscured by shadow, blurred as if caught mid-motion, was a figure. A man. Standing just inside the edge of the frame. His face turned slightly away, but enough remained to show what should never have been there. Daniel sat back, staring. The man didn't look like family. He didn't look like anyone Daniel recognized from the neighborhood or from school. He wore dark clothes, something about them too plain, too uniform, and a hat pulled low, shadowing his features. But what chilled Daniel wasn't the man's presence. It was the way the camera had tried, and failed, to ignore him. As if the lens itself had resisted capturing him fully. He set the photo aside and kept going. Another Polaroid, this one of a group of children, all seated in a semicircle on a floor Daniel still couldn't place. Again, the wallpaper. Again, the eerie stillness. And again, in the background, near the doorframe, the man. Further away this time, even blurrier, but unmistakable. The same outline, the same head tilt. Like he'd been standing there the entire time, waiting for no one to notice. Daniel began pulling photos out of the box in handfuls, lining them up across the table. Image after image. Children, most of them unfamiliar, posed unnaturally or caught mid-motion with empty expressions. And somewhere in nearly every third or fourth photo there he was, always in the periphery, always watching. It wasn't possible. Some of the photos were years apart. The hairstyles, clothing, and quality of the film made that clear. One dated in pen as early as 1986, another as late as 1995. Different houses, different groups of children. But the man never changed, not his posture, not his distance, not his shadowed face. Daniel's hands trembled. He looked closer, bringing one image under the lamp. The light caught a glint just enough to illuminate the shape of the man's eyes, barely visible beneath the brim of the hat. They were wide. Too wide. And black. Not like pupils. Like holes. He dropped the photo, and it fluttered to the ground face down. There was no explanation for it, not one that made sense. He could rationalize the tapes, the journal, even the room. Trauma did strange things to people. Memory could be manipulated, photos altered. But this consistency across time, this figure that should not be cut through every defense he'd built. Someone, or something, had been there all along. Not just with Emily. With others, watching, inserting itself into the edges of lives it didn't belong to. Daniel picked up the photo once more, stared at the figure in the shadows. The man had never spoken. But now, Daniel was certain he would. Daniel spent the next 2 days at the dining room table, surrounded by stacks of photographs, loose paper, and his laptop glowing in the low amber light of the chandelier. He barely ate, barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, those hollow-eyed children frozen in time, cradled in the washed-out tones of old Polaroids. They stared back at him from the photos as if they knew he was watching. As if they'd been waiting. He started with the names. He didn't have any, not at first, just faces. So he focused on the backgrounds, deciphering faded logos on t-shirts, zooming in on fragments of decor, looking for anything that could place the images. One photo had a pizza box in the corner with a partially visible area code. Another showed a school hallway bulletin board, the mascot barely legible, a cartoon ram in red and white. It was enough. One by one, he began to track them down. Newspaper archives, online databases, Reddit threads devoted to cold cases, the missing, the forgotten. It was slow, grueling work, like trying to reassemble lives that had been deliberately shattered. But the deeper he dug, the worse it got. Because he started finding them. Not in real time, not alive. Not walking and breathing. But as names and case numbers, scanned photos and old police bulletins. Missing persons reports, most of them yellowed or digitized from print, bearing captions beneath each face. Last seen outside school, disappeared from her backyard. Vanished during a family camping trip. He recognized their faces. He knew their names before reading them. There was Kevin Daly, age 9, missing since 1988, from a small town in Iowa. Rachel Lynn, 7, gone without a trace from outside her piano recital in 1992. Omar Reyes, 6, vanished walking home from the park in 1990. Each of them was in one of Daniel's photos. Same wallpaper, same eerie stillness, same room. Different states, different years, no obvious connection. They had disappeared hundreds of miles and months apart, but here they were together in a box that had been hidden inside his house. Emily was not the first, and she hadn't been the last. The realization sat in his chest like a stone. These weren't random victims. This wasn't coincidence. Something had been collecting them, bringing them into the same space, photographing them, watching them. And no one had noticed. Not until now. Daniel scrolled through the articles again, searching for common threads, but there were none. No shared relatives, no school ties. The authorities had treated each disappearance as isolated, tragic, but ultimately explainable abduction, runaways, family disputes. None of the cases had been solved. They simply faded from the headlines. Faded from memory. But the house hadn't forgotten. Neither had the box. He reached for the last photo in the pile, one he'd skipped before. A boy, younger than the others, curled in a corner. His head turned away from the lens. At first glance, he seemed unfamiliar. But something about the angle, the posture, caught Daniel off guard. He flipped it over. No writing, no date. He turned it back. The boy's shoes. The red laces. They were the same as a pair Daniel remembered from a summer long ago. A friend of Emily's. A boy who had come over once, just once, and never again. His name was Mark. Daniel hadn't thought about him in years. He searched the name. And there it was, another report. Mark Feldman. 8 years old. Missing since 1993. The same year as Emily. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the air suddenly thin, as if the house itself had drawn a breath. They had all disappeared. Scattered across the country. Across time. And somehow, they had all ended up here. The town library had a musty smell that clung to its walls like old secrets. Daniel hadn't been there in years, not since grade school field trips, and overdue book warnings from the stern librarian who used to man the front desk. She was gone now, replaced by a younger woman, who kept her eyes on the screen and barely looked up when he walked in. That suited him just fine. He wasn't here to talk. He was here for folklore. What had begun as a hunch, an instinct sharpened by everything he'd seen, had turned into something closer to desperation. The photos, the sealed room, the man in the shadows. It was all too intentional to be coincidence, too orchestrated. There was a pattern here, something beneath the surface of the town. The kind of thing that didn't make it into police reports or news articles. The kind of thing that was whispered between generations, passed like ghost stories around fireplaces and campgrounds. He found it in the local history section, buried in a dust-coated volume titled Myths and Murmurs of Merrow Creek County. A thin spine, no author, no publication date. Just brittle pages and hand-drawn illustrations in the margins. He flipped through tales of ghost miners, phantom trains, weeping women in the woods. Then he saw the phrase, "The Hollow Hour." The chapter was short, barely 2 pages, but it felt heavier than the rest. The text was handwritten, as though added later by a different hand. Different ink. The lines trembled. "They say there's a time between times," it read, "when the world softens and breathes in reverse. When the sky forgets to pull tight and the walls between things thin like old skin. Some call it the hollow hour. Most forget it entirely." Daniel read on. It described the hollow hour as a liminal sliver of time occurring not at midnight or dawn, but in the hour just before waking, a moment suspended between sleep and consciousness, where the mind is most vulnerable, where dreams leak into reality, where things come through. During the hollow hour, the house may creak a new way. A voice may call from the corner. You may rise without rising and walk without moving. And when you return, something might be missing. It didn't say what exactly could be taken, or why, only that people had spoken of it in whispers generations ago before the rational world overtook the magical. The myth had become a joke, a campfire dare. But the old handwriting warned otherwise. If it remembers your name, it will come again. The more you search for it, the more space you give it. Memory is the door. Grief is the key. Daniel closed the book, his fingers trembling slightly. He thought of his father's journal, of the line, "If no one remembers, maybe it will stay asleep." It echoed now with chilling clarity. What if his family had known? What if his father hadn't just been grieving but trying to protect them from something real? Not a man in the usual sense. Not even a spirit. But a force. A presence that fed on the moment when the mind wavered on the threshold between knowing and forgetting. The hollow hour. It made too much sense. The erased memories. The missing police files. The way no one in town wanted to speak her name. What if forgetting wasn't just a failure of grief but a side effect? What if remembering called it back? Daniel felt it, then a shift. The light in the library dimmed slightly, though no clouds moved outside. A pressure in his ears, a whisper he couldn't quite hear. Maybe it was already here. Maybe it never left. The whisper had become nightly now. Always just before dawn, always from the same place behind the walls near the stairwell, where the shadows gathered thickest. Daniel had tried ignoring it, tried reasoning it away as the product of exhaustion, stress, the erosion of his own sanity. But it always returned, and it always spoke with her voice. Daniel. So he recorded it. The idea came to him in a moment of frustrated clarity, standing in the hallway at 417 A.M. Phone in hand, chest rising and falling with the shallow rhythm of fear. He hit record and waited. The whisper came, as it always did, slow and hollow, barely rising above the creak of the old pipes or the tick of the thermostat. Daniel. His name, drawn out like breath, fading into fog. He stood motionless, the screen glowing faintly in his palm, heart hammering with a pulse he could feel in his teeth. Later, with daylight seeping through the windows and his nerves steadier, he played the audio back. The whisper was there, as clear as he remembered it, but something was off. Beneath the voice, Emily's voice, there was texture, a vibration, like another layer of sound hidden under the first. He couldn't unhear it now. It was buried just beneath the surface, like a second pulse behind the beat. He transferred the file to his laptop and loaded it into a basic audio editor. He isolated the whisper, stripped out background noise, slowed it, stretched it. Still, that second sound remained a tremor under the words. So he did what he hadn't dared before. He reversed it. The waveform twisted into a jagged shape, unfamiliar and jagged, He hit play. At first, it was nothing but static and garbled distortion. Then something cut through. A voice. Low, male, gravel thick and dry, like it hadn't spoken in years. Not the whisper, not Emily. It was saying his name. Daniel. Again. Daniel. And again, this time more drawn out, rising at the end like a call waiting for a response. The sound was wrong in a way that went beyond pitch or tone. It felt dimensional, like it didn't belong on the audio spectrum, like it was pushing against the limits of what a recording could contain. It scraped against his ears in a way no human voice ever had. He sat frozen, skin cold, staring at the screen like it might offer some logic, some reasoning. But none came. His sister's whisper was a veil. Behind it, this thing had been speaking all along. Mimicking, hiding, using her voice as a lure. And now, for the first time, it was speaking with its own. He rewound the file and listened again. This time, he counted. It repeated his name 11 times in a row before going silent. On the 12th playback, it said something else. Not a name. Not a word. Just a sound, long and sharp and full of hunger. A breath taken inward. As if it was preparing to speak again. As if it was remembering how. The sledgehammer felt heavier each time Daniel lifted it. His palms were blistered raw, his muscles shaking with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop now. The walls of the house had lied to him for years, hiding, concealing, whispering through cracks in the plaster. No more. He swung again, the head of the hammer slamming into the basement's far wall with a dull, cracking thud. Dust exploded outward in a soft cloud, and somewhere deep within the structure, something groaned. Not the wood, not the stone, but something older, deeper, almost like breath. He didn't know what he was hoping to find. Closure, maybe. A final truth. But part of him already knew that truth would not bring peace. Whatever had been done here had roots that went further than memory, deeper than grief. This wasn't just a secret chamber buried beneath a family tragedy. It was something else. A wound in the house. A cavity where something had lived and fed on the silence left in the wake of his sister's disappearance. With one final strike, the foundation crumbled inward. Behind it was more than a hidden room. It was a corridor. Narrow, damp, carved roughly into the earth. The stone walls wept with moisture, and the air smelled of old copper and rot. Daniel shone his flashlight forward, its beam catching something etched into the surface symbols. Carved with deliberate, obsessive precision. Circles intersecting with crooked lines, eyes within spirals, hands that bled into roots. He traced them with his fingers and felt the temperature shift. The walls weren't just stone. They were holding something back. He stepped deeper. The corridor gave way to a chamber larger than it had any right to be. The ceiling arched like a cathedral, though jagged and low. The symbols continued here, more frantic, as though whoever carved them had run out of time. In the center of the room was a pit, ringed with stones and broken shards of what once may have been furniture, or toys, or something unidentifiable, twisted by age and heat. The air pulsed. He could feel it against his skin, pushing in and pulling away like a tide, like breath. Then he saw the marks. Along the floor, scratches, deep, chaotic, desperate. Some small, like made by fingernails. Others gouged wide, like something had dragged itself across the stone over and over again. Not trying to escape, trying to stay inside. This wasn't a room. It was a prison. And it had been sealed, not with locks or chains, but with memory, with ritual, with forgetting. The symbols weren't decorations. They were instructions, warnings. And now, after all these years, they were faded, broken, eroded by time, by neglect, by absence. His family hadn't just suffered a loss, they had made a pact. To erase, to silence, to seal. And it was failing. The walls felt warm now, breathing. The voice wasn't behind them anymore. It was in them, through them. He could feel it listening, watching, remembering. A vibration ran through the floor beneath his feet. Not an earthquake, not construction. A heartbeat. Daniel stepped back, light shaking, breath caught. The pit trembled slightly, a fine dust rising from its edges. And for the first time since entering, he felt something rise, not fear, but recognition. This was the center, the origin, not of her disappearance, but of everything that followed. The house had kept it hidden. But walls remember, and now they were beginning to speak. He had returned to the crawlspace with no plan, just instinct, and a weight in his chest that refused to lift. The symbols beneath the foundation still echoed in his mind. The taste of the air in that hidden chamber clinging to the back of his throat like rust. Something had been buried, contained, but not destroyed. Never destroyed. The crawlspace was smaller than he remembered. The floor sagged slightly as he crouched, the air thick with mildew and rot. He'd already searched it once, found the shoebox, the broken boards, the first clues, but this time he knew where to look. This time he let the feeling guide him, the one that had haunted him since the whispers began. A magnetic pull, not toward a sound, but toward something deeper. Something waiting. His flashlight flickered as he reached the far end, past the old furnace and the loose bricks. Behind the low beam of the foundation wall, where the shadows pooled the darkest, there was a gap he hadn't noticed before. Small, just wide enough for a child to squeeze through. He dropped to his stomach and crawled forward, the flashlight clenched between his teeth, its beam bouncing across the dust and filth. The space beyond was colder, the air unmoving, stale, like something that had been sealed for decades. He reached the opening and peered in. At first, he didn't see her. Just a shape, curled in the corner like a pile of discarded laundry. Pale skin, arms wrapped around her knees, long hair matted to her back. She didn't move. Didn't flinch at the sound of his breath catching in his throat. The flashlight's beam trembled, and the light landed on her face. It was Emily. Not a photograph, not a memory, not a whisper behind plaster, but not quite her either. Her eyes were open, wide and unblinking, reflecting the light with a glassy sheen. Her skin was smooth, untouched by time, as if the years had passed around her. The blue dress she had worn the day she disappeared was faded now, its fabric frayed at the hem but unmistakable. She hadn't grown. She hadn't changed. And yet, something in her face was wrong. Not misshapen, not monstrous. Just hollow. Too still. Like a wax figure remembering how to be alive. Her lips moved. Daniel. His name, spoken like a ritual, without emotion, without weight, as if she'd said it 1,000 times to empty air. He crawled closer, voice caught in his throat. Emily? Her head tilted slightly, bird-like. Her eyes never blinked. Her lips parted again. Daniel. The sound was soft, familiar. But behind it, under it, there was something else, a second rhythm. A second voice, buried so deep it barely broke the surface. He reached out a trembling hand. Emily, it's me. I'm here. She didn't move, didn't answer. Only whispered again. Daniel. Like it was all she knew how to say. He watched her mouth the name again and again, rhythmically, as if it were keeping her alive, or keeping something else asleep. Her fingernails were raw, the skin around them bruised. The wall behind her bore dozens of marks, scratches, shapes, half-finished drawings. And then he noticed the floor beneath her was carved with the same symbols from the chamber. Faint. Weak. Fading. She wasn't trapped here by accident. She was kept here. And the thing that lived just behind her eyes, just beneath her skin, wasn't finished. She hadn't left. She had been waiting. She didn't speak in sentences, not at first, not in the way Daniel remembered. There were no full thoughts, no conversations. Only murmurs and fragments, loose words that drifted from her lips like ash, barely coherent, almost too soft to catch. But he listened anyway. Night after night, crouched near the crawlspace, flashlight burning dim beside them, his voice trembling as he coaxed her memories forward, like someone brushing dust from old photographs, hoping what lay beneath hadn't yet faded. She never looked at him when she spoke. Her gaze wandered the corners of the space, as if she were watching something only she could see. A crack in the wall, a beam above their heads. Once, the floor. Her fingers traced the symbols carved there, over and over, her nails pressing harder each time. When he asked her about them, she only whispered, "They told me not to forget." He asked who. But she didn't say. Some nights, she would sing half lullabies, half crooked phrases that didn't seem to belong together. Rockabye would melt into "Don't open the door," and then dissolve into whispers of numbers, backwards, then forwards again. She wasn't reciting, she was remembering. And somewhere inside that broken rhythm, pieces of her story began to form. They had taken her. Not in the way people meant when they said kidnapped. Not by a man with a van or a stranger at the park. No, what took Emily didn't need keys or locks. It slipped in during the hollow hour, when the world had softened and memory thinned. It called to her. Through the wall, through the floor, through her name. She had followed the voice. And she had fallen. She spoke of a room with no doors, a place with corners that didn't meet, of eyes in the ceiling, of humming that never stopped. There were other children, she said, but only in echoes. Shadows of them, like chalk outlines drawn on air. And there was him, not father, not man, not anything she could name. She never described him the same way twice. Sometimes she said he wore mirrors. Other times, that his voice came from under the floor, that he didn't blink, that he wasn't always there until you remembered him, and then he never left. "He split me," she said one night, voice barely audible. Like paper, like string. And Daniel understood. She hadn't just been taken, she had been divided. Whatever had drawn her into that place, into that house within the house, had carved her into pieces. One part held captive, left to whisper through walls and crawl spaces. The other, taken somewhere else, used, changed, preserved. And somehow, impossibly, both parts had survived. Daniel thought back to the years after her disappearance. The strange dreams he'd had. The voices that came in the hour before dawn. The way the attic floorboards creaked in a rhythm that didn't match his own breath. He'd spent his whole life trying not to remember, just like his parents, just like the town. But memory, it turned out, was never the problem. It was the forgetting that fed it. He looked at her, at Emily, or what remained of her, and felt the truth settle over him like a shroud. She had never truly left. Because something had never let her go. The house had always breathed differently when no one was speaking. Daniel realized that now, not just recently, not only after Emily vanished, but from the beginning. In the silence after dinners, in the heavy pauses after arguments, in the quiet that filled the rooms after laughter drained out, the house fed on those moments. It learned to survive on them. He could feel it in the walls now, like an animal stirring in its den, sensing the threat of abandonment. He stood in the living room with dust curling in the morning light, the floor beneath him groaning with age and something else, something that had waited far too long to be noticed. It wasn't a home anymore. It never had been. It had been a trap designed to look like comfort, like safety. A place built not with love but with forgetting. He saw that now in the worn carpet, the faded wallpaper, the photographs that had once lined the shelves, now long gone, erased piece by piece until only silence remained. Emily was gone again. Not in body, her body was still somewhere beneath, curled in that half-lit crawlspace like a question unanswered. But whatever part of her had survived, whatever piece had whispered his name, had gone quiet. As if releasing the truth had taken what little of her was left, She hadn't resisted when he said goodbye. She hadn't cried. She simply watched him, eyes wide and glassy, lips parted but silent. He boarded the walls first. Plank by plank, nail by rusted nail, sealing every crevice where air could pass, where memory could leak through. He knew it wouldn't hold. Not really. Not forever. But it was ritual. And sometimes, ritual was all that stood between a person and madness. The doors came next. The basement. The attic. The crawl space. He drove nails deep into the frames until the wood cracked and splintered, until the walls trembled beneath his hands. With every board, he whispered apologies. To her, to the boy he had been, to the man who had tried to understand and failed. By the time he stepped onto the front porch, the sun was already slipping behind the trees. The house loomed behind him, hunched and dark, its windows watching like eyes pressed against glass. He stood there for a long while, unsure if he was done, or if the house would let him go. And then he walked. Down the overgrown path, past the rusted mailbox, toward a town that had learned how to forget too well. Each step away felt lighter, but also wrong. As if something was unraveling behind him, something that had been bound only by his presence. A thread stretched between memory and silence. Halfway down the street, he heard it. His name. Not shouted, not spoken, just breathed. Daniel. He froze. The wind moved through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. The sound came from the shadows, from the stillness, from nowhere and everywhere at once. He turned, but the house remained still, shuttered and silent. And yet the whisper followed. He kept walking. The voice came again, softer now, closer. It had learned. Home wasn't a place. It was a wound that traveled with you. A cage not of walls and doors, but of memory and grief. The house had never needed to trap them physically. It only needed them to remember. And now he always would.